Kia ora, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I hope you've got somewhere snug and warm to watch if it's cold where you are. We're really grateful that you've come along tonight to join us. My name is Chris. I'll do a quick introduction of the organisation and myself, and we'll get going. So tonight's webinar has been organised by Aotearoa COVID Action. We are people from all walks of life. We believe it's our responsibility to work together to ensure a healthy and safe community for everyone. Kia ora, no awabako whenua I papaka a Maui o ko tipuna. Ke ti noho ao ki Waimea Aotearoa, ko Jensen toku whanau, ko Chris tiko ingoa. Hi everyone, my name's Chris. I was raised on Awabako land in Australia and I live in Richmond, New Zealand. I volunteer with Aotearoa COVID Action because, like I imagine many of you, I'm concerned for the health of my whānau. I'm also the head of engineering at a software company. Our work depends primarily on the ability of myself and my team to get out of bed every morning and think clearly. So I'm quite concerned about the impact that increased illness is going to be having on myself and the people that I work with, which is why I'm really grateful to be able to introduce our two speakers tonight, Oliver and Dr. Andrew Dickson. Both have got really practical examples to share of how they've been active in their community, protecting people's health. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Justine, who shared with us a brief karakia to get us started. Mā te whakapono, mā te tumanako, mā te tiro, mā te whakarongo, mā te mahi tahi, mā te whakamomori, mā te aroha, ka te e matao. By believing and trusting, by having faith and hope, by looking and searching, by listening and hearing, by working and striving together, by sheer desire and determination, by all being done with compassion, we will succeed. So, just before we get started, quick, just some housekeeping stuff. Probably you've been on a Zoom webinar before by now, but just in case, do put your questions for the speakers in the Q&A. You should find that at the bottom of your screen. There should be a little button that says Q&A that you can pop up to put any questions in. We'll save questions and answers for the end of their presentation. You're also welcome to use the comments. The webinar tonight is for people who want to take action on COVID, so do please keep your comments and your questions on topic and keep this a respectful and safe place, a place that respects people's privacy. This session is being live streamed to YouTube also. Please feel free to take screenshots or quotes that you think are really salient and share them with the hashtag #CleanAirInSchools. Just to let you know, this webinar may contain traces of DIY. The reason I say this is that I know some people, when they see people talk about technical things, they think, oh, this is not for me, this is too much. And so I just wanted to assure you that a lot of this is really practical. You don't have to be a hands-on person or a DIY person to be able to use the things that are being shared tonight. Keep in mind, there's probably other people in your school that you can ask for help. But even if not, there are other ways to go about the things that are being shared tonight. So just, yeah, I would hate for people to sort of see things get technical and check out and feel like this webinar is not for them. This webinar is meant for you if you're here. Also, this is a safe space for learning. Unfortunately, COVID has become a really politicized issue. We're not here to pass judgment on anyone or like their behaviors or anything like that. It's really about creating a space where we can learn and improve and work together to figure out how we can create safe spaces for our tamariki and our whānau and our community. As I said, we'll talk a little bit briefly why we've chosen schools, why we're looking at schools tonight, and then I'll hand over to Oliver and Andrew to share what they've been doing. And then lastly, we've got 30 minutes to talk about taking action in your school and how you might bring this, the things that you've learned into your school. For those of you that joined us at our last webinar, we'll sort of build on what we talked about last time. So, why schools? Schools are a hub in our community. You know, we know that. We know they're a hub for the community. That also means that they're a place where if we're able to prevent infection from spreading, then we can also prevent it from spreading to the community. When our kids get sick, they bring it home to their parents in turn potentially bring it into work or whatever else they're involved in. So it's a really important place where we can intervene in keeping our communities healthy. Even our Prime Minister acknowledged this a few weeks ago, highlighting that, you know, when COVID breaks out in schools, it has ripple effects beyond the school. It impacts the teaching workforce. It means kids have to stay home. It means parents have to stay home and they can't go to work. We know that from information collected by the Ministry of Health that teachers are really at a high risk. So we see the case rates are much higher than anyone else in the community. So right up there at the top at 41%. And then the next one is people who work in childcare. So yeah, teachers really facing the brunt of illness in our community. This results, again, in teachers being unable to teach because they have to take time off. It means in the worst cases, even this year, a school had to return to home learning because they didn't have enough teachers to take care of the kids at school. And we see even if schools aren't closing, they're losing hours. They're losing lots of teaching hours, and we know that that has an impact on the kids' learning. There are also some other effects that COVID has had, unfortunately, in our communities. We often think of COVID as only affecting adults, but you know, kids have adults in their lives. And so that again has knock-on effects for the kids in our community. And of course, kids themselves can get sick. This is an article that was published by the Public Health Communication Centre, highlighting some of the health impacts that COVID has had on kids. And of course, we don't just need to talk about COVID, right, for health impacts. We know that there are other illnesses, airborne illnesses going around. And everything that we do to keep kids healthy in school, again, is just another way that we make sure that they're able to stay in school, they're able to stay healthy, they're able to get on with the things that they want to do and that we want to do. All of this, I thought, was summed up really well by Dr. Amanda Kowalczyk. School should be one of the safest places a child can be. This is a quote that was shared at our last webinar, and it really resonated with a lot of people. We go to so much effort to make school a safe place for children, whether it's being sun smart, whether it's you know, making sure that they can cross the road safely, and all the other, you know, we could spend so long, and we did at the last webinar, listing off all the ways that we make schools safe. So this is another way that we can do that. Speaking of Dr. Amanda Kowalczyk, just take an opportunity to plug our next webinar, 16th of May. She'll be joining us along with 2 other speakers. I'll share again more details at the end. And those who are at the last webinar know I will harp on about this. Bring your friends. This is not something that you have to do alone. Find people who also share your concern for our community's health. So lastly, the good news is that there are ways that we can act on this. There's been really great work done in the community. What I'm sharing here is something that was published not that long ago, back in March, and they shared 7 goals for healthy schools. The links are there, very easy to find online. And some of these things are things that we'll see examples of in the talk today. So I don't want to keep us from our guests any longer. So I'll start by introducing Oliver. So Oliver is a family of 3 school-aged children. He's a software engineer by trade and a maker in his spare time. He has developed a range of DIY CO2 monitors that makes it easy and effective to monitor and maintain clean air in classrooms. And I think he's also going to give us a sneak peek tonight at some work he's been doing on air filters as well. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Oliver.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Kia ora, everyone. I'll just share my screen if I can. Hang on. Where are we? Where's my presentation? Oh, here we go. Hope you can see that. So thanks for the introduction, Chris. As you've already highlighted, I've got three kids in school. I've got a background in making things, and I'm a software engineer by trade. Throughout the beginning of COVID, I have been monitoring the situation in schools overseas. I have come across a group of people in Germany who's been building CO2 monitors and deploying them, hundreds of them, to different schools. And was always interested and curious. And once we, you might remember, once we moved to the new traffic light system at the time in December 21, when it became a bit more clear that there might be community transmission and no longer school closures and lockdowns and so on, I started, looking a bit closer into this, and I got a little bit more concerned. So I put together a prototype. That's the image on the bottom left. You can see it's very, very bare basic, just a CO2 sensor and a small display and some lights at the bottom, and took that to the school principal. And we had a quick chat, and luckily everything went quite well, and we had 20 classrooms outfitted with CO2 monitors. So they're similar to the next photo to the right, with the one in the white case. But I've also helped other childcare centers, other organizations, gymnastics, heart hospitals got a CO2 monitor, libraries, and even a bar in Wellington's got one. So it's been great to see that people have been picking up on them and acting on them. Just a refresher, Chris has said most of this already. Important for this talk tonight is that COVID is airborne, so it doesn't just spread by surfaces or kind of larger droplets, but it just spreads through shared, rebreathed air pretty much. And it can cause serious short and long-term health issues in children. So it's not mild on children, as we've been told for a time. It's been becoming more and more clear that it has some pretty serious implications, and repeat infections are just simply making it worse every single time. Schools drive infections into the communities. We all know that when kids start going to school for the first time, they come home with all sorts of infections. And COVID is no different, and because they're going home to their families and in the wider community, it just means it's spreading it there. And you will have immunocompromised and other vulnerable people in any kind of community. So keeping the schools safe is really important, I think. This year also marks the first winter where we don't have any mask mandates in schools anymore, so barely any mask wearing. And limited protection from vaccination, in that there's no boosters for most children available, and they're less and less efficient against latest variants. So what can we do when we're looking at indoor air? There's 4 ways that we can look at. The first one is the most obvious, pretty much, wearing masks. We all know, unfortunately, it's no longer a reality in most cases, and while everyone can still wear a mask, they work much better if it's two-way masking, so if everybody wears a mask. And I won't spend much more time on this. I think there's enough information out there. Instead, I'll talk a little bit more about ventilation. There's 2 ways that we can look at. One is natural ventilation, which just means opening doors and windows. And then there's mechanical ventilation, which you have more in an office building, hotels, and so on. So it's basically an HVAC system, but some schools also have these kind of systems, and new builds more and more will have these. And ventilation just helps by moving stale air out of the room and replacing it with fresh outside air. Alternatively, there's air filtration or purification, where the air is just being pushed through a filter that is fine enough to remove viral particles and other dust, particulate matters, and so on from the air. And last but not least, a bit more looking into the future, is ultraviolet light, germicidal irradiation. So I'll talk very, very briefly about that. Ventilation is the main focus. Studies have been shown good ventilation can reduce transmission of viruses by 82%. Now, I think that's huge. It's a very large number. Just imagine schools being at the center of a lot of outbreaks and being able to reduce those numbers by 80%. How many less long COVID cases and other COVID infections that means on the population level? I think it's quite impressive. Besides that, ventilation also improves or reduces the CO2 levels in classroom, and even outside of diseases and particularly COVID, having less CO2 in a classroom means better student performance and fewer absences through sick students. So the table at the bottom is taken from a Ministry of Education policy. This predates COVID, so this is in the context of policies for new school buildings. It might be a little bit difficult to read, but the last two rows basically show the impact of elevated CO2 levels on student performance. And you might be able to see student performance improves by 20% with reduced CO2 levels, not 20% better in exams, tests, or whatever. That's massive. That's the easiest way to get better results from your students. And also good ventilation reduces absence in schools by 10%. And again, this is pre-COVID, but those are quite impressive numbers. And I encourage you all, when you're hitting any resistance talking to schools or other places, I think these are pretty powerful arguments and they're coming straight from the ministry. Ventilation also helps reducing other diseases, so RSV is becoming a bit more of a problem, whooping cough, flu, also things like hay fever, mold, and so on. But in colder areas, and Andrew can probably talk a little bit more to this, it can be challenging. It's not always an option, so just keep that in mind. Now, looking at CO2 monitoring, why are we looking at CO2? Basically, when we breathe, we inhale oxygen, we exhale carbon dioxide. And measuring the level of 2 in a room just shows how much fresh air is in the room compared to how much of the air has been rebreathed. And rebreathed air might contain viral particles. If there's somebody who's infectious in the room, they just breathe out virus particles and they hang around in the room in the same level as CO2 does. So it doesn't mean we can measure directly if there's virus present in the air or not, but looking at the CO2 levels, they are very good and close indicator of the potential for viral particles in the air. And looking at some specific numbers, 800 ppm, parts per million CO2 has been widely agreed or accepted as a good level to aim for, good in the context of it is a relatively safe level to prevent infection, but it's also achievable. So of course, the lower the better, but you'll hit practical limits quite quickly. So 800 is something to keep in mind. And a quick reminder for those who might not know, outside air is about 420 ppm. It's a little bit seasonal. It's just been hitting 425 ppm, I think, recently. So it's increasing every year a little bit, unfortunately, at the moment, but that's where we are. And also, please note that elevated CO2 levels don't necessarily mean that somebody will be infected, particularly when you walk into a classroom and there's a flashing CO2 monitor in the corner or whatever, and some children or teachers might be concerned or freaking out about. We don't want to create any panic. It doesn't mean that anybody will get infected. It just means there's a higher risk in that room compared to when there's less CO2 or better ventilation in the same room. Now looking at CO2 monitors, so that photo on the top left, you can see one of the monitors that we're using on the left with a big bright green light. So they just have a green, yellow, or red light. They've got a small CO2 sensor and a Wi-Fi enabled microcontroller in there. And they're just hanging on the wall somewhere away from a window or a door, and give a very easy to notice indication of the CO2 level in the room at the moment. And you might notice it doesn't even have a display to show the actual reading. In comparison, on the right, you see the AirNet 4 monitor. This is the device that's been mainly handed out by Ministry of Education to a number of schools. And you can imagine, just looking at it, just imagine you're a teacher in a busy classroom, you're trying to do your job, you're 2 meters or more away from that monitor. There's no chance that a teacher will pay attention to this. You might not be able to read the number in the first place. Even if you do, you have to actively monitor it. You have to kind of do the math in your head. What does this number mean in terms of, is it yellow, green, red? Is it safe? Do I need to do something? There's a small indicator. You see the black box over the green area, but again, that's unreadable from a distance. And there's other limitation in that it can't store the data for very long. It requires people to just collate the data from the monitor regularly with their phones and so on. That's why I think they're not really fit for use in a classroom. But my key points are, for when it comes to CO2 monitors, they must be easy, actionable, so there can't be a distraction. You don't need to pay attention to see what's happening. It's really, really important to drive the behavior change that we want to see, because otherwise people will forget. And I'll come back to that in a little bit more detail. But the other aspect that's really important too is recording the data and storing it in a database so that it can be used for analysis to recognize some patterns or to drive dashboards, remote alerts, and so on. This is really important because different classrooms, even when they're in the same building or in the same school, can be a lot easier, a lot harder to ventilate just because of how the room, where the room is, situated, whether it's more exposed to the wind or not. You can very quickly see that more modern buildings often are much harder to ventilate because they're better insulated, right? The seals are working much better and so on. So the data recording and being able to look at the data is really important, and you'll see some data, some graphs on the following slides. Just in general, if you're interested in a CO2 monitor, it's really important to have a look that it's using a high quality CO2 sensor. So NDIR is the technology to look for. Some of the cheap monitors you can buy, they just measure volatile organic compounds and extrapolate CO2 from it. They're easy to detect by just using some hand sanitizer or other solvent next to them. And if that makes their CO2 reading go crazy, then it's one of those that you don't want to use. And also all CO2 monitors, sensors, and that includes the aeronets, they need regular calibration, otherwise they start slowly drifting. So most of them do that automatically by just assuming that they get exposed to clean air every now and then recalibrating that reading against the configured 420 or whatever it is. But if you're using one and you're just using it occasionally, just make sure that you check it every now and then, that it's still kind of showing a good reading. Now, yes, this is a slide from, or this shows some data, some CO2 readings from a local school from winter last year. So this is August, relatively cold day, 20 classrooms, and you can see that most of them are staying well within the 800 ppm range or even below. So the background colors mirror the lights that are shown on the actual device in the classroom, green, yellow, red, and what's purple on that graph is the flashing red light. But you can see that the majority still stays well clear of red, and a lot of them even barely go into yellow. So this is amazing. This is the hard work of the school and the students. And compared to other schools, I've been working with researchers from University of Otago and looking at the NIWA study that the Ministry of Education did and published. So you'll easily have classrooms hitting 2,000, 3,000 ppm normally, even on fine days. So these are absolute dream values. So I'm quite proud of the school achieving that. One thing that you might not be aware of and that you can figure out using a CO2 monitor is CO2 and also viral particles can hang around quite a long time in a room. So this is just showing a room that was used until like 9 in the evening by somebody, and then they left, and didn't open doors and windows. You can see CO2 is very, very slowly declining, but it's hanging around until almost 12 hours later, so the next morning. Now, this is still a relatively safe level, but you'll see the same pattern if there's much more CO2 in the room. So what this means is after school, if there's a parent-teacher interview or some other activity in school, you might walk into a room that looks totally fine, but might be full of COVID viruses, and you've got no way of telling. You just walk right into it. It can be hours for it to disperse. But it is not everything is great. Even the school that was doing really, really well in August. This is a diagram from September. Those green lines are basically, there's a line per classroom, and those are aggregated levels across the month of September. So the color matches the color shown on the monitor. So green, yellow, red, or dark red. And you'll notice a lot of black in there towards the end of the month, and that coincides with the dropping of the mask requirements and also the infamous Fox poster that the Minister of Education released, and unfortunately ended up in our school being put up next to the monitors. So for whatever reason, people got tired of it. There's a lot of fatigue. Teachers turned off the CO2 monitors in the classrooms and just got rid of it, because it is work, right? It is hard work sometimes. It's not always easy, and we just have to keep that in mind, so it's important to keep people engaged and doing the right thing. But this was a very, very frustrating month after everything else worked really, really well. Something else that I wanted to show you. So this shows 3 or 4 classrooms. They ditched the lights on the CO2 monitors that we put into the room. So we just turned off the lights, but we're still measuring the CO2, and replaced them with AeroNet monitors. And you can see those lines that are deep in the red. Those are the ones where the teachers relied on AeroNets instead of the other monitors that we had. And for me, that just shows 2 things. First of all, we've got no sense for CO2. So you might imagine, you walk into a room, and if it feels like really, really stuffy and you feel tired and so on, by that time we can actually feel that CO2 is like it's much higher. It would be way off the chart on this graph here. But if it's just slightly elevated, or even quite a lot elevated, like some of those lines here, there's no way of us telling. And the other thing that it shows is these are the same teachers and kids and classrooms that have been sitting at 800 and below the previous month, so like previous 6 months, basically. So even with their experience and their change in behavior, while they've been doing really, really well before, without the constant feedback that they no longer received, they got it completely wrong. And that also highlights that what the ministry has been doing for some time by just supporting spot measurements every now and then, and having 1 or 2 monitors to go around in a school just to check every now and then is completely insufficient. You have to have that constant feedback. Without that, everything falls apart. Good ventilation. What can we do? It's just a brief summary. A lot of this is also on the Ministry of Education website. So some of the policies are actually really good. So I encourage you to have a look and have a read of what's available. Keep the doors and windows open on adjacent sides of the room. So basically you want cross ventilation, air coming in on one side and kind of leaving the room on the other side, as long as it's not getting too cold, right? So we can't we can't have the kids sit there at whatever, 10 degrees freezing. Then it no longer works. But as long, as it's comfortable from a temperature point of view, just keep doors and windows open. Some rooms might not allow you to do cross ventilation. What can help is putting a fan in the door, or pointing at the door, and try and push the air through a little bit more. CO2 monitor will really tell whether that works or not. Or if it's really hard to ventilate, there are other options, and I come back at the bottom too. The next thing that's recommended is what the ministry calls reboot the room. So at least 4 times a day, or when you get elevated CO2 readings, briefly for a few minutes, open all doors and windows, consider to leave the room for a few minutes. And I mean, we can see that happening during lunch breaks and so on. But it's also encouraged, again, this is what the ministry recommends, 4 times a day or more often, do a whole reset, just get rid of all the old air and put some fresh air in. Now, when it's getting colder, when it gets a bit more challenging, what you can do is in the morning before school starts and before the students turn up, just leave all the doors and windows closed, turn up the heating, make sure the room gets nice and warm, and that will store the heat in the furniture and the walls and so on. So the air itself doesn't really store that much heat. Most of the warmth is in the furniture. So heat it up, and then don't leave the doors and windows just open a little bit, but instead every 15 or 20 minutes, cross ventilation. So just opening doors and windows, purging everything in and out really briefly, and closing doors and windows again. This will make sure that there's enough clean air around, but at the same time, it doesn't get too cold. Now, of course, there are limits, but this can work quite well. And I know that in other countries in Central Europe where it's much colder, schools are doing this. And also I have lived in Finland and Helsinki for a year, and it gets minus 25 degrees out there in winter, and people still ventilate. So I think if they can do it, we can do it too. Just keep it brief. And having a CO2 monitor is really key for this. So they will tell you when you need to ventilate and when not. And that is very nicely visible in the graph in the top right corner. Now, the background might be a little bit hard to see, but that line is hovering along the boundary between green and yellow. So what that means is every time the light turned yellow, somebody got up, opened the door or window, improved ventilation, and the level went down again. It had red once very briefly, but this is exactly the behavior you want to see. And last point. Again, this comes from the ministry. If a room is hard to ventilate and you've got consistently high readings, there are other means available through the ministry. So talk to property management, whatever that means. Your mileage might vary, but I encourage you to raise it. I know some schools have taken out a window, for example, and replaced it with a piece of plywood with a fan in there just to improve ventilation and so on. So that there might be other things available. Now, when it gets too cold, when we're heading into winter, or specifically in the more southern parts of the country, ventilation doesn't always work, and we have to acknowledge that. We can't expect teachers to sit there with kids with like blue fingers and shaking their teeth and everything. It's just it's not an option, right? But what we can do instead is we can use filtration, and you probably all have seen these air filters like in that photo or similar ones. They just push the air through a very fine filter that holds back virus particles. Most of these units that have been supplied, though, are completely insufficient from the airflow rate. So the one that you can see pictured, for a typical classroom, you would need about 4 of them running at the maximum speed, rightly placed across the room to achieve the equivalent of 800 ppm. And I say that because there's a link at the bottom, the cleanairstars.com/filters, where you can put in the size of the room. They've got all the different models in there. You can check the airflows and so on, and it tells you exactly how many of those you need. Now, one of the biggest issue with these air purifiers is they often, for whatever reason, are only run on a low setting, and one of the reasons could be noise, because sometimes they get quite noisy, or some of them are a bit more noisy. Sometimes there's other reasons I can't really tell. Quite often the filters are clogged up, so they're not really serviced or maintained. Filter replacements tend to be quite expensive, so they don't really work that well. But what can be done instead, and me having that DIY maker background, I jumped onto this, of course, is what's called these quasi-Rosenthal boxes. I'll show you a photo on the next slide, but they're basically self-made filters that have a much bigger filter surface and a much more quiet fan. So here's two of those boxes that I've built. The one on the left was the first one I've done. You see a filter panel on the front, so there's 4 of them, one on each side. They're quite common in the US, for example, where they're used in ventilation systems, furnaces to heat houses and so on. So they're quite cheap over there. They come in different standards. MERV 13 is the filter standard that we're looking for. It's not the same quality as a HEPA filter, for example, that's been used in hospitals. But that's compensated by making the air pass through the filter a number of times by using quite a powerful fan on the top. Normally what people do is use a cheap plastic box fan. Now, they weren't available in New Zealand when I built this, so I got this high velocity fan, which is a bit of a beast. So this box is overkill and it's loud, but it really works quite well. And trust me, anybody can build one of those because it is literally filters and cardboard and duct tape and nothing else. You might want to stay away from that heavy fan and use a different lighter fan though, but it works. And there's heaps of instructions on the internet available. On the right hand side is where quasi-Rosenthal boxes are moving towards at the moment. So that one is pretty much the same principle, but it uses some computer case fans. They are really, really quiet, so you can hardly hear them. And that's the main advantage over the other ones. And they're a bit more easily available here in New Zealand as well. It's important to make sure that these fans are pressure optimized so that they can actually build up enough pressure to force the air through the filter. If they don't do that, then it'd be quite inefficient, but there are a few brands available that have specific fans optimized for building up pressure, and they spin relatively slowly, but they're quite powerful at the same time and quiet. I've also, the other thing I've been doing is I've been putting CO2 monitors into these boxes as well, which means when we've got a classroom where ventilation's really good, we've got enough outside air in there, we don't really need the filter too much. The fans can spin quite slowly, but once ventilation gets worse, they spin up and force a lot more air through. This is such a great example. So I picked this off Twitter, but this is a school that basically went away, did a STEM project where they taught about the science behind quasi-Rosenthal boxes and virus transmission, how they work, how they can be built and so on. And then they turned it into a competition. So every classroom was fundraising their own filter and building them. And you can see there's all sorts of different variations and creativity in there. And I just think this is absolutely amazing. And I would love to see every school doing this because it keeps the school safe and the kids learn a lot about it and they do their own thing. So this is excellent. Lastly, a bit of an outlook into the future, hopefully. So another way of cleaning the air is using ultraviolet light. Now, this is technology that's been used for surface cleaning in hospitals and theaters, but also in water treatment plants and for food treatment. So it basically works by UV light destroying the cell with the virus DNA inside, just breaking it apart. So it's inactivated, it will no longer infect you. Now, there's a problem with UV light, and you all know that from exposure to sun in summer, it can damage the skin. So that's why we've got two options. There are some systems that constrain the UV light to the top of the room, just under the ceiling, and they've got some safety switches around there so that if somebody reaches up there, they'll turn off and so on. But it basically means that all the air that reaches the top of the room gets disinfected pretty much. Newer developments are using a different wavelength of UV light, so it's UVC light, 222 nanometers. And that light is considered safe because it doesn't penetrate the skins or the eyes deep enough to cause any damage. Again, any installation will probably still keep that towards the top of the room. But these devices are available at the moment. You can buy them now. They're used in New Zealand hospitals, for example. I've seen them sitting at about $2,000 US, I think, per room. So it's not crazily expensive. And since COVID will probably stay with us for a few more years, I would really love to see these things rolled out into classrooms and offices, because they're least intrusive. You don't need to do anything. They don't disturb anybody. And the cost is absolutely manageable. It's not very expensive compared to replacing filters or doing anything else. And sick teachers. So wrapping up a little bit, engaging. What can you do? So this is my takeaway and my experience. Your mileage may vary, and I want to acknowledge that I've been very lucky with how things went, and I'm in a privileged position in that I had this prior work to build on, and I can do these things. But my recommendation is get yourself familiarized with the facts and the policies. Read the ministry bulletin. You'll get all the information from there, what their regulations are, because some of them, like I said before, are actually really good, and schools are sometimes ignoring them. I didn't know anything about this stuff 2 years ago, so I've kind of self-taught all these things, and so can you. It's really important to keep talking to other parents and teachers, principals, board of trustee members, and so on. I acknowledge it's hard work. It can be frustrating. Even some of my closest friends that are going to the same school are, telling me this is also good, but they won't really do anything about it. But keep engaging. It's really important, and just ask some open-ended questions. What are the schools actually doing to prevent COVID spread at the moment? Because most schools, they don't encourage masks. There's pretty much nothing being done anymore. They're more worried about so many other things than they are about COVID, and that's just plainly wrong. It's important to keep an open mind and listen to concerns. One of the examples that comes to mind is a friend of mine is a teacher, and he has been saying that he can't always teach wearing a mask. It has challenges, and I've got to accept that, right? And in the same way, we can't, like I said before, expect the kids to sit in a room with perfect fresh air, but freezing and being cold, and getting sick because they're too cold. So just keep that in mind. But also, hold those people in charge accountable. Health and safety is the responsibility of the school. It sits by default with the board of trustees. It's usually delegated to the principal, but they've got a responsibility to keep the children safe. And again, you can ask some questions there. For example, the ministry still recommends not doing full assemblies, I think, indoors, keeping everything outdoors. I don't know how many schools are actually doing that. Ministry is still recommending mask, options of online learning, and all these good things. And at the same time, a lot of schools still have outdated COVID policies that mention the traffic light framework or other things. And that's not really a good look. That's basically neglect by the board, right? Really important, lead by example. So, wear a mask if you can, get a CO2 monitor, or build one of those CR boxes, do whatever you can, but seize the opportunity. So when I walked into that principal's office with my very, very basic prototype first, I was prepared for a lengthy discussion, and I was not prepared for this leading anywhere. I was expecting this, to be very, very difficult sell, but 5 minutes in, and I had the approval to outfit all the rooms, and including the funding, which again, is very privileged that it worked that way. But if you've got something to show in your hand, and I've seen that again last week when I took one of my smaller CR boxes into the school, and I didn't even talk about it, but people approached me. The principal talked about it, brought it up by himself. I didn't even have to put his attention to it. It's, in my experience, that makes a huge difference. And if you are able to do something, it's a lot harder to stop you when you've already done something than when you're just sitting there and talking about things. No matter how good your arguments are, if you can just do something, whatever it is. And last not least, here's the email for Ministry of Education's ventilation support group. They're there for your support. Let them know if you've got any problems, if you need their support. That's their job. That's what they're there for. Tell them when there are problems. Looking back, I'm really impressed by the engagements of the students. They went and had a look. They tested the sensors by burping and farting. I don't know about the farting, how that worked, but into them, just blowing into them, make them go crazy red. That's all fine. That's what we want. You know, it's their environment. You know, it's where they go for the whole day. So they need to understand this stuff. But I'm probably most impressed by just watching them. As soon as the monitor changes the light, just a student gets up, opens the window, gets down again. There's absolutely no disruption. It just happens automatically. A teacher doesn't need to do anything. It's amazing to watch. And it's absolutely possible if you involve them and, you know, take them seriously. It's a massive learning opportunity. But continuous engagement with the school is needed. So I have to go back to school and remind them and talk them through things and answer questions and so on. We just had a trip on a school bus where CO2 was just going through the roofs, and that's frustrating, right? You would have thought that they know about these things by now, but unfortunately not. Keep an open mind and evolve. So the animation is just ended. Let's see if I can kick it off again. So the display you see on the right hand side, we've changed the traffic light green, yellow, red to this kind of animation that is meant to kind of emulate a fresh air tank. So you can see the fresh air kind of leaving the tank. It's changing from green to yellow to red. And once fresh air comes in again, you'll see green bubbles coming back into the tank. So that's what a UX designer came up with, and we've been rolling that out to the school, and the feedback's been really good. Whereas before we had some concerns around some children's being a little bit anxious about dark red lights and so on. So this seems to be working a lot better, which is great. But it's not something that I thought of when I started. Yeah, and also the cost of any of these things is just absolutely nothing. It's very low compared to the cost of sick staff, even for a school, even if you just ignore everything else, everybody's health and the safety of children and so on. But it's a good reminder when you talk to board of trustees or schools, just ask them, you know, how many sick staff they had, how much it costs them, and how much it would cost them in comparison to put up some monitors and some air filters. There's a few links, and then I want to hand over to Andrew.
Hi everybody, kia ora. I'm Andrew Dickson. I'm going to, if it's all right, I'll just talk to these these points here. So thanks, Oliver. I just wanted to really pass my thanks to Oliver. I learnt so much about all of this stuff by talking to him. I got a couple of his CO2 monitors right at the beginning because I was quite worried, like everyone else, about what was going to happen during schools in last winter. So I installed a couple of the monitors that Oliver had made in my kids' classrooms. I have 2 kids, and went through the kind of process of trying to figure out how that would work and how to get the kind of class involved. So what I guess one of the first things that I want to say is you want to be able to, the best thing to do is try and work in collaboration with the school management and with the teachers and with the kids. But if you can't always do that, you can use, and I have done this, an ARRowNet or hidden in a mesh pocket of a school bag or a coat or something, in order to try and measure what's happening in a classroom. I've talked to quite a few parents who've done this exact kind of thing in order to try and gather some understanding about what's happening in their kids' classrooms. But for me, as a recovering sociologist, what that really shows is this kind of disconnect between how we should be interacting with our schools as parents, having a close relationship with them and understanding what's going on. But it really does happen. So it's a difficult process. And the first thing I would say is try and build a kind of collaboration. And you can also, and I think people should, Oliver's put up the links. Feel comfortable leaning on the Ministry of Education to provide more tech. So whether that's monitors or purifiers, just use that resource. They listen to parents. They are concerned about what parents think. I think particularly, and I've used this argument quite a lot. So I want to kind of focus what I'm talking about a little bit around the protection of vulnerable kids. Some of you might know my son Ben, who's about to turn 13, suffered a brain injury during his birth, and he has a whole lot of issues, and he's really vulnerable. And the way that it's worked for me is by talking about the access to the curriculum argument. So my point is always that my son deserves as much access to the curriculum as any kid. And for that to work properly, he needs to feel safe, and it needs to be as safe as it can be. I felt this way before COVID, so I was really concerned about most of this stuff, in 2017 and 2018. And COVID came along, and for a very small period of time, everybody thought like I did, and then that's gone now. So I'm back to that kind of trying to draw attention to what vulnerable means. But also the important thing here is to define vulnerable very widely, because we don't really know who's vulnerable to repeated respiratory infection. We don't really know who's going to develop things. I mean, I read a recent study that suggests RSV might be the reason why childhood asthma is kicked off. And certainly both my children were diagnosed with asthma following RSV infections when they were little. So I define vulnerable very wide. I talk about asthma, kids who've had previous trouble with respiratory infections, kids who've got minor autoimmune issues, kids with disabilities, and you can draw attention and say, well, all of these kids are, deserve to have the best kind of environment possible. And that doesn't even talk about the vulnerable people they have at home, or the teachers, or the teacher aides and their families. I think that, so the school that my kids go to still reports COVID-19 cases. They do it in a very careful way. So they don't break any privacy rules. They just tell the community whether there's been a COVID case, and allow parents to make decisions around that. I think that they've always kind of done that, and they've never stopped. And partially that's because of the continuous discussions that I'm having with the school about wanting to know about the safety levels for particularly Ben, but also for lots of other kids. I found it really useful. So I live in Central Otago, in a tiny little town called Pātiaroa, which is near Ranfurly. My kids go to school in Ranfurly. And it is the coldest school in New Zealand, I think would be fair to say. There's I think Ranfurly has the record of the coldest day ever in New Zealand. It's something like -24 or -22 in 1915 or 1920, something like that. And it's extremely cold in winter. So we regularly have mornings that are -9 or -10, and it doesn't really get above 5 or 6 on those days. So it's really cold. Opening windows on both sides of rooms, it's just impossible. The kids are freezing, the teachers are freezing. They had last winter, there was a new part of the school and an old part. In the old part of the school, they had trouble getting the temperature up, even with all of the windows and doors shut. It was really difficult. Luckily now, the school is entirely new, and it has a brand new ventilation system and built-in CO2 monitoring. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on. But so last winter, I needed to help the teachers position purifiers to have them be effective and not disruptive. Now, I know Oliver's talking about air changes per hour and number of purifiers, and he's entirely correct. To get the kind of ventilation, or get the kind of equivalent ventilation, you really need to have 4 of these things, and they need to be running full, and they're really loud, and it's annoying. Having said that, my argument was always like, if you've got them, use them and run them as loud as you can to make it work, because it is going to help. And our general aim is to try and reduce chains of transmission. So Chris was talking at the beginning about schools being seeding into the community. There's no doubt about that. There was some talk about it not being the case, but that talk is not true. They absolutely are. They don't have to be. They could be where chains of transmission stop. So my argument is always in that positive frame, like we can work towards trying to stop chains of transmission rather than accepting this kind of, accepted wisdom that schools and early childhood centres are like petri dishes. We should be able to do better than that, and we can. So I think working with the teachers, and also using, depending on the kids that you've got, what kind of kids you have, you can actually use that kid to try and work out what's going on in the classroom. I had one where I needed to do that a bit, and one where I really didn't, depending on the kind of support that I had. And do use your credentials, get people involved. I've advocated for a few people in different schools. They will listen to you, and it's useful to do that kind of work. And whatever you do, don't stop digging. So try and keep gathering data. So I'll tell you a bit of a story. So the school that my kids go to it's brand new, has a brand new ventilation system with built-in CO2 monitoring and separate heat pumps for heating and cooling. So the teachers can adjust the temperature in the room, and it doesn't impact on the ventilation system. So I thought, okay, this is awesome, right? And I thought, I can forget about it now. But when I went digging, I discovered that they'd set the ventilation system to begin, so start ventilating, when the CO2 monitor built-in one had reached 1,000 parts per million. So their aim was to try and keep it below 1,500 as a standard. Like they would let it get up to 1,000 and then keep it above 1,000 but below 1,500, which is not okay for me. So I managed to get that dropped to 700. So what happens now is when the CO2 hits 700, the ventilation system kicks in, and it pretty convincingly keeps it below 700 in all of those kind of classrooms. So I went yesterday and picked up my son a bit early, and the kids had been in the class with the teacher who was reading a story for about 40 minutes with all of the windows and doors shut. And the CO2 in that room was 640. So, and that's because the mechanical ventilation system was running, and you could hear it, but it had the equivalent probably of what Oliver's computer fan powered CR boxes would now. It's very quiet, and you can feel the air moving around. So this, I think, is where the future is. We need to be getting all classrooms into this kind of state, plus upper UV, like I'm with Oliver on that. Can you change the slide, Oliver? Yeah, so challenges, and I can't say this enough. Teachers and other school staff are really overworked, I mean, you know this if you're a teacher or you're in this kind of area. Extra stuff is a burden, even if it seems like it's really simple. Little things are a burden, and that is not to be underestimated. So a lot of the work that I've done has been around volunteering my own time and my thinking, and to try and help people, to try and take the pressure off them. But at the same time, I'm very cognizant that every time I go and talk to a teacher or a school principal about this kind of stuff, I'm actually asking them to do more work. And I'm very aware of that, because I don't think we pay them nearly enough. I mean, we're probably all on the same boat about this stuff. There's also a strong kind of comfort with, things as they are. And I think it's really important not to underestimate the pull of normal. This kind of, we need to get over it, we need to get back to normal. That kind of desire is really strong, and it's in so much, of our daily interactions and the way we work, and the way we parent and the way we do everything. So trying to get people to change their behavior. I mean, you could see it with Oliver. The readings in August versus the readings in September. Behavior is very easy to flip back to what it was before. So you need to kind of constantly work at that. It's not something that just automatically will follow. And you have to be careful with that, and be recognize that it's not always going to be easy and not always going to work. I mean, a good example of this is masks. My son Ben, he's probably the only kid in the class who shouldn't be wearing a mask. To be fair, it totally messes up so much of his life and his ability to communicate, especially he's, quite deaf in one ear and that sort of thing. But for so much of the time, he ended up being, the only kid in the class wearing a mask. Now we've got to a point where other kids in the class wear masks if they've got family members who have COVID and they're at school. I wish they weren't at school, but that's about the best we can kind of get because of that kind of pull of normal. So also school governance model is really decentralized. So it isn't that we can go to the Ministry of Education and say, enforce this kind of policy. It doesn't really work like that. It's far more dispersed. But in that, there are also opportunities, so that there are ways of doing things and getting things done, in those particular models. But that kind of depends on having, people in the school who are on your side. And that can take quite a lot of time to kind of build that up. One of the challenges for me was some quite bad advice from the ministry, particularly around thresholds. And I don't think there was any intent for this to be. In fact, most of the stuff from the ministry is great now, particularly. But we need to be pushing that 800 ppm figure. It's very well accepted, and we just need to say we need to be aiming to keep it below 800. And that gives, I think that as a communication device is so much easier, and it gives us an action to start working towards, and I think it's manageable as well. And the other challenge, and this is everywhere I'm sure, but the whole anti-vax, anti-government, or just anti-thinking kind of actions of people. A parent said to me a couple of days ago that the Chinese had invented this and released it to show the world they were in charge by forcing lockdowns, and in a group of parents outside of school talking. And there's a level of just holding back that is important to maintain that. So what I always do is I fall back on, I'm trying to improve the quality of the year because it reduces absence, and reducing absence means that your kids can go to school more, so you can go to work more, and you can keep running the farm better, and it's not as disruptive. and life is more normal, right? So that argument in itself, I think, makes sense to a lot of people. About the only argument against that I've heard is, well, kids need to build up immunity. But in fact, that's actually, they're going to do that anyway, because, they collect as groups and they're not always at school in the other areas. So that's what I go to. I think Oliver had said this in his presentation as well. There's data. It definitively shows that the better the quality of the air, the lower the rate of absence. And I think that as an argument is very, very strong. Okay, I'm going to leave it there so we've got some time for Q&A. Chris, can I hand that back to you?
Yes, thank you, Andrew and Oliver. So now we've got some time for Q&A with both the speakers. Do use the Q&A button if you're in Zoom. I can see one question's in there already, which is great. If you're watching us on YouTube, if you want to post, I believe the comments are open there. If you post a question in there, one of our moderators will be able to copy it over to the Q&A over here, so we can answer those questions too if you've got any. So we've got one question to start with. Please just pop any others that you've got in there, and we'll get to them if you've got them. Let's start with Sandy's question, which I guess is addressed to both speakers. How do we address the pull of normal? Have you responded to people who used that argument? Andrew, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I have thought about this a lot in my academic work. I used to teach a postgraduate course called the Psychology of Organizational Change, and the theory around why people always revert to normal, or the pull of normal, is really fascinating. So organizations try and change things all the time and they fail miserably. IT systems are a classic example of that. I think the important thing to emphasize is to say everything is always changing. So although we think things are normal and they're static, it's mostly our perception. So we're mostly filtering out the change that's going on around us until we really have to address it. So, I mean, climate change is a good example here. We're starting to see some real shifts in the way that people are thinking about climate change in our country, partly driven by the impossibility of continuing to maintain normal. So, my argument with this is always, for the act of normal, is we're not really trying to change anything about your life. We're trying to improve the quality of the air. And improving the quality of the air is something that we've been doing all the time. We do it in airplanes, we do it in households, we do it in hospitals. It's a very normal thing that we're doing. We're just now trying to do this better in schools because we understand it better after a couple of years of a pandemic. But it's actually a very normal part of life. That's generally where I kind of start from. And then I immediately drop into, we're trying to stop absence. We want the kids to be well so they can go to school, so that you can go and do whatever you need to do. Oliver?
I think you've pretty much said it all. The only thing that comes to my mind is last year in winter for the children, doing the ventilation and keeping the room safe. That was their normal, right? The kids knew what to do. They did it right. The change back to the old normal came from the teachers and the parents. So, if we keep them engaged, absolutely, like you said, Andrew, things are changing and we are constantly learning and improving and so on. But we need to keep an open mind. And if we design systems in a way that they're easy to use and easy to adopt and so on, then that makes change easier. And it's all towards the better in the end. It doesn't matter where this virus has been coming from. If we can all stay healthy and avoid some other things along the way, then that's a great outcome.
And Oliver and I have talked about this numerous times in the past. The more hands-off you can design a system, the better it is for everyone. I mean, that's why we look at FAR UVC and think, that's an answer, because it goes in and then you stop thinking about it. Yeah, so we've always been pushing for that kind of thing.
Thank you. We've got a heap of questions now coming in. We'll have to go through them pretty fast because we do still need some time for what we've got planned for the rest of the presentation. I'll go quickly to Kate's question. What do you recommend is the first thing or tactic to start with when engaging a school?
So I think you'll have trouble if you don't have someone in the senior leadership team. It depends a wee bit on the size of the school, but if you've got no principal, deputy principal, dean or someone in charge, then you're just going to run into problems. Even if you've got a teacher who's on your side, they have to try and get things through, and those people who make decisions. So trying to get someone like that. Schools are very sensitive about absence at the moment. So I would use that argument to try and build that data and say, we have that, the Ministry of Education's got that data. There's a recent study out, you probably saw it, Oliver, I think, was it from Finland about, or maybe it was from Japan or Korea, I think it was from Korea, about the number of year changes and the subsequent reduction in absent days. So schools are sensitive about that. So you might be able to go on with that kind of argument to try and get decision makers on board.
I think it can be really, really hard. You can be quite lucky in having a very understanding principal, or sometimes it's more like the Board of Trustees. If you can't get any progress out of them, the best approach is probably try and connect with other parents, or even the Ministry of Education can help as well. I know it can be very time consuming and frustrating, but just try and find a way that works. The science is on our side. There's nothing bad about what we've been talking about. It's a win-win for everybody. The stuff is cheaper than not doing anything. It is healthier. It is, easier for the school as well. But just like Andrew said, they're busy with other stuff and so on, so they might need a nudge. But get informed, understand some of those arguments in terms of absences and what the cost associated with that is and so on, and then follow that avenue. Work with the media as well, potentially local community papers. All these things can help. I had a group of scouts up in Auckland building MyCO monitors, CO2 monitors, so children making them themselves and rolling them out. So there's a lot of stuff that can be done, but just be unstoppable. I know it's hard, but keep on trying.
Yeah, I totally agree. Don't stop. And there will be parents in the community who feel the same way that you do. And getting a group of parents together is surprisingly effective. The ministry is nervous about parents who are pissed off. So we have quite a lot of power as parents.
And you can sit on Board of Trustees meetings. You can request the meeting minutes. You can send ORA requests to your school. So just sending an ORA request what the current COVID policies of your schools are and what they're actually doing and what the absences, that will ring some alarm bells for most schools, I would have thought. So you can do, try other avenues first, right? But there's all sorts of options that you can try. So keep going.
Thank you. We'll do one more question. For those questions that we haven't been able to get to, we'll see if we can find other avenues to get answers to that question. So last question. Also, actually, just before that, I just wanted to highlight a comment that was made. Somebody made a comment in the chat, just noting that both Andrew and Oliver have been very lucky to have supportive schools, and they've talked about that a little bit and about getting together with parents. Stick around. That's what we're going to talk about next as well, is how do we build that support in the community, because we're not all that lucky. So the last question, what are the expectations about schools making available classroom reading levels and students off with COVID?
Yeah, so the schools don't have to tell the community about what absence they have in their school. They can choose to do that, and they do with lice, for instance, I think. If it's a notifiable disease, then they have to tell the Ministry of Health about cases, but they don't have to email parents. Well, it's a bit tricky. Maybe they do. So I don't think we've really tested this very well yet. And this is sort of one of the things that I've been quite interested in pursuing about whether you would be able to compel a school to notify. And it isn't something I've had to do. And that is precisely because I'm extremely lucky in the school that I've got, because they're still doing this. But I do think if you've got a vulnerable child, then you do have there's a moral question around why they're not warning you if there's an outbreak or an impending outbreak, or, that kind of thing. Our school also has a policy of asking siblings to stay home. So if a kid has COVID, they ask the siblings if they'll stay home. They can't stop them coming to school if they don't test, if they've tested negative. But most of those kids don't come to school. And the school's very supportive of that, because they don't want outbreaks, because outbreaks breed absence. The outbreaks aren't good for anyone. There is no one on this in our entire country who could turn around and mount an argument that a COVID outbreak is a good thing for a school, right? We're aiming to stop that. And yeah, sorry, I'm probably going to tie myself in knots if I keep talking. Oliver, do you have anything to add?
Just one quick thing, again, request the Board of Trustees meeting minutes. Sometimes they have absences listed in there. But as far as I know, our schools no longer need to report COVID numbers to the Ministry of Education, which means if they don't publish it, I don't think there's a way where you can force them to actually tell you. You can, you can ask about staff absence. You can see how many teachers are absent. It'll also reflect on the school's finances, how many relievers they need to pay for, and all these kind of things. But you won't get direct numbers if the school refuses, I think. One thing that crossed my mind, I know of at least one case where there was a parent with a vulnerable child where the school didn't cooperate, who got quite some progress in the end by involving the Ministry of Education. So getting the ministry to supply some monitors against the will of the school, actually forcing them into the school. And in the end, it took about a year, but in the end, the school is cooperating now. So that can also help. None of this is great, and it's partly due to the decentralized way of schools are being managed, unfortunately.
And it's really unpleasant. Like there's nothing pleasant about fighting against the school, and this, it is very difficult. Yeah.
But at the same time, if you manage to get like sneak a CO2 monitor into a classroom, or like I have done on a bus recently, show the school those readings compared against the ministry guidelines. They're not great, but most schools would probably even exceed those. And then remind them of their health and safety responsibilities. They have to do something to keep your kids safe. So just remind them of that. It's not a pleasant discussion, and I know I'm not a born New Zealander, but some people kind of refrain from a conflict and everything. But if it's about the health of your child, you might choose to do that.
And that is entirely doable. Like if you get an ARINET 4 monitor, they're very, like, you don't notice them. Like they're terrible if they put them on the wall because they're so unnoticeable. But if you can put it in a meshed pocket on the outside of the school bag, and the school bag's in the classroom, it'll give you a day's worth of measurements. It'll connect your phone at the end. You can print out the graph. You can say, this is what was happening in that classroom all day. and they can't argue with the data. I mean, the data is the data, right? It's, you know, it's how much is it, Aaron? $400 or 450?
Yeah, 400.
You might even be able to borrow one from the library. And you just pop it in there, get the data, get your graph at the end. I mean, if you want, you can contact me, and you know, we can go, oh, this is what we think relative to the things. You go to the board and say, how is this protecting my child? And they can't ignore that. I mean, they have to do something. Sorry, Chris.
Thank you both. No, that's all right. Well, we should end the questions there. Thanks again, Andrew and Oliver. I'm going to jump into actually, just to wrap up there, just to echo what both Andrew and Oliver were saying. You know, they both talked about absences, about air quality. There's been some stuff about this in the media lately, as Andrew, I think, said. Constant talk about like school absences. So it's a good point to talk about. From the Ministry of Education themselves, they say that missing just half a day of school can lower levels of achievement. And on the flip side of that, there's a study just recently that's showing as little as 1 litre per second per person increase in ventilation is associated with 5 fewer days of absence. Put those two together and do the math. There's some really great wins that can be had on student performance. So I want to thank our speakers and move across to our next slide. Done Q&A. So once again, if you want to get in touch with either Andrew or Oliver to ask them questions, they've left information where you can contact them, follow them. Do look them up. So the next thing, just to wrap us up, was just to recap a little bit on taking action in your school. If you attended the last webinar and you are one of the people who's invited more people to come to this one, well done. Thank you so much. I've been looking at the numbers. We've got almost double the people that came last time on this call. And I'm sure that is a testament to the people who've been working hard to reach out to people in their school, in their community. Because as Andrew said, you know, people may not be speaking about it, but people are concerned. Nobody wants to see their kids sick. So I'm just going to recap a couple of key points. If you were here for the last webinar, now might be a great time to pull out your chat group with the people that you've contacted with, and maybe start making a few plans about, you know, who you're going to reach out to next. So the key things to remember: you really want to find more people advocating, and we talked about kind of the science of change at the last webinar. But the numbers are actually really promising. Like, you don't need to have a majority of people in your school to push for change. As Andrew said, the ministry is nervous about parents who are agitated. You can find as little as 3 people, maybe even in some cases 2, that can be enough to create a tipping point, particularly if you're talking about, like, you know, you've got 2 or 3 people with you advocating on a board of trustees, for example. That can be enough to cause change. Do at least find one other person, just so that you're not doing this alone. This is much easier when you've got someone else. The other thing to keep in mind is finding that trusted pathway to your decision maker. So if you've got a good relationship with a decision maker already, like Andrew and Oliver were fortunate enough to, fantastic, great, go straight to them. Maybe you don't have such a great relationship, so having a think about who you do and who they trust, and finding the trusted pathway to them. Who are they going to listen to? Who's going to listen to you? And seeing if you can find that way to get to the people that will be able to make a decision. Spending a little bit of time sitting down and thinking about that can make a real big difference to how successful you can be. And last session, we brainstormed the people that you can reach out to in your community, or the people that you might be able to find who are either supportive or help you talk to the decision maker. There's lots of different people to think about in our community. Sports clubs, other social clubs, local charities that the school might engage with, and who have, you know, beneficiaries or others who are at risk and who are thinking about this stuff. Union representatives, alumni of the school, heads of departments, parents, students who have vulnerable family members, families who have vulnerable students. last webinar, we took time to to give everyone some time. We don't have the time on this call, but take time to write out a list, think through all of these options. You'd be surprised who maybe doesn't come to mind initially when you think about this stuff, but once you think through, it's like, oh yeah, actually, I think it would be worth having a chat with that person. I think they'd be interested. Excuse me. So connect with potential allies in your school community and put yourself in their shoes. Why would they want to collaborate with you? What are the concerns that they have, and how does it connect? Andrew shared some really great examples of this, of all the different things that concern people, whether it's absenteeism, whether it's a vulnerable member in their family. What I would ask you to do, and we've put these webinars on to support you so that you can start to build this community. And it always helps to have a deadline when you're working on something. So your deadline, if you choose to accept it, is 16th of May, when we've got our next webinar. And if you aim to bring 2 more people along, then that's 2 more people in your school community who can help you. I'm really excited about this webinar. We've got some more great speakers. I'm so grateful to our community who have who've gone to the trouble to reach out to these people. So we're going to be talking about health. We had some questions this week that were really great questions to be asking the people that are going to be attending or are going to be speaking at this webinar. We'll be putting more information up on the web, but we've got 3 great speakers. I can't wait for us to have them on. For you to hear from them, and they'll be talking more about the health impacts, what we know now after 3 years, what we've learned about how it impacts children, how it impacts our community, even personal stories, and also someone who's going to share with us a long view, thinking strategically about what this means for our children 5 years, 10 years down the line. Really excited about that. We also have coming up on the 6th of May, a repeat of our webinar from earlier. So this is the webinar where we go into real depth about organizing allies in your school, how to find them, how to talk to them, so that you can not have to go this alone. Your chances are greatly increased when you're working with other parents, other members of your community. So that's at 2 p.m. on the 6th of May. Not far off, just 4 days. Do come along if you're interested in learning more about reaching out to people in your community, getting tips for how to do that. Yeah, we're looking forward to running that. That's it. This video is available. It should be available as soon as we stop, I think, on YouTube. So do share this with people that are interested, invite them along to the next webinars, sign up to our mailing list so you can find out about the next webinar and the next webinar after that. Excuse me. Oh yes, and the other thing, if you've registered for this webinar, you will get an email, or have probably already received one, but we'll send you a reminder how to connect to the Slack community that someone has set up on this. Andrew and Oliver are on that community. Lots of other parents are on that community. It's a great place to ask for suggestions, ask for advice, share success stories as well. We need to hear those, right? So do connect with that as well. It's a great way to stay connected with others who are working on making change in their community. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. I'm looking forward to seeing you again at our other webinars. Thanks again to Oliver and Andrew, and thanks to everyone in our community who's helped put this together. Thank you very much to T and B and to Pooja as well, who've all been helping out behind the scenes to make things go really smoothly. And thank you for showing up and for lending us your time and for caring so much about the health of your community. We'll see you soon, hopefully.